Welcome back to my course, History of Socialism. Today we are going to discuss a decline of socialism in Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, and China. Or, as you will see in my lecture, I labeled it simply as retreat of communism slash socialism, because these societies socialist societies, which we could see in Eurasia. See, that's the expression I use, Eurasia. It means Asia and Europe. They were known under both label of socialism and communism, so they were used interchangeably. Okay, so we could call them communist societies. Eastern European countries such as Poland, Bulgaria, Eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Soviet Union, and China. And basically, these societies used the Stalinist model with different modifications, of course, as the major blueprint to build socialism, okay? Because it was the only model available to the left at that time in this part of the world, Eurasia, that could be used and recycled again and again and again. Remember, we talked about China, where Stalinist model was used to build Maoism. Okay, in Eastern Europe, Soviets occupied the whole area by Red Army in the wake of the Second World War. And in Eastern Europe, communist regimes imposed by the Soviet Union, they copied literally the Stalinist model. Okay, the topic of our discussion is how these societies, which were modeled after the Soviet Stalinist blueprint, they started to crumble on their own without any war, without any direct intrusion from outside. They started to crumble economically, primarily for economic reasons, and people literally started to opt out of this system. Okay, and it happened in the 1970s. In 1970s, the process of decline of the socialist countries in Eurasia started and continued until the end of the last millennium, 1990s, accelerated in 1980s and continued in 1990s. What is interesting here is that it was the process that acquired this domino effect, a snowball effect. Okay, what we observed in on the wide spaces of Eurasia, in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and China, in fact, could be observed in other countries. And I'm going to mention this at the very end, because during the same years, and especially in 1990s, we could observe the same decline of socialist ideas in Africa. We don't have, for instance, too many countries at that time, 1990s, who claimed socialism like it used to be in 1950s, 1960s. Like such countries like Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and many others, they started to play down socialism, eradicating the whole phrasing about socialism. In the Middle East, Arabic countries, which had claimed socialism as well. Even Saddam Hussein at some point claimed socialism. Yes, I'm not kidding, in 1970s. Okay, they totally muted this talk, so no more socialism. The slogan of Arabic socialism that was popular in Syria, in Egypt in 1960s was dropped, completely dropped in 1970s, 1980s. In Latin America, the same process. We may observe the same process. Here, socialist movements, they started to decline. India, the second biggest country after China, started also to purge socialist ideas. Again, of course, unlike other countries that claimed socialism, building socialism like China, Soviet Union, India was still a democratic country, and she tried to experiment with elements of democratic socialism. But still, since 1991, India too rejected these ideas and started to transform herself along capitalist lines, started to revive market system, reducing the presence of the state in economy and social life. China, the biggest society, which we are going to discuss either today or next time. If we have time, we are going to discuss China today. If not, we will be doing the next lecture. The whole talk will be about China. China was the biggest country. They started to gradually drift away from die-hard socialism, and it started in 1978, before the Soviet Union collapsed. Okay, and the process still not complete until the present day. What killed socialism? Essentially, it's economic reasons were behind the collapse of socialism, and people were changing their minds about socialism. In the time of war, in the time of emergency, when martial methods were needed, mobilization was needed, socialism, the state socialism, which was based on the Stalinist model, it could well exist because it could be justified by war conditions. That's what we see in the Soviet Union, in China, where warfare amplified Stalinist ideas. The whole idea of mobilization became very popular. Okay, but as soon as the time of peace came to dominate the life of the people, and we do have a prolonged peaceful period from 1945 until the end of 1970s, there were no global wars. It was a long period of peace, and in the time of peace, this Stalinist model of socialism revealed its economic inefficiency. And that's what we mean when we talk about the collapse of socialism. In the 1970s, 1980s, in the Soviet Union, the cradle of socialism, we have so-called period of stagnation. That's how these years became known in the history of Soviet Union. The period of stagnation. Why? Because after Khrushchev, remember, who declared de-Stalinization, Khrushchev, who denounced the cult of Stalin. After Khrushchev was ousted from power, and it happened in 1964. Why? Because the communist nomenclature, the communist elite, was afraid to lose power. That is why they toppled down Khrushchev, who threatened them. Okay, who downsized the secret police, downsized the military, and also started to attack the party bureaucracy. There was a fear that he could go further. He was reckless. That's how he was viewed by the party bureaucracy. They ousted him, and they froze de-Stalinization, the Soviet elite, this nomenclature. They froze it. They said, enough, we're not going this way, because if we go this way full-fledged, we might destroy the Soviet socialism. Okay, so there was a fear, and that is why this period when de-Stalinization stopped in 1964, this period became known as the period of stagnation, which lasted from 1964 to 1982, when the new general secretary of the Communist Party, named Leonid Brezhnev, he died. So basically, this period of time can be labeled as the period of Brezhnev. Leonid Brezhnev, that was the name of the guy who was in power. Again, I will mention him again. We'll show his picture. Okay. Centralized planning was preserved. Collectivization of agriculture was not abandoned, so it was preserved. So all these blueprints or major pillars of Stalinism, they were maintained. Yes, regime became more soft. It was not so brutal and ruthless like it had been under Stalin, when people were shot and thrown in concentration camps. So there were no concentration camps in 1960s, 1970s, but still those people who were speaking against Soviet socialism, they were penalized by prison terms. There were about 500 dissidents, so people who were penalized by small or long prison terms for speaking against Soviet socialism. They were not shot, but they were put in prison. It did happen, but not always. On many occasions, people were simply kicked out from their jobs if they spoke a politically incorrect speech, if they violated speech codes, for instance, accepted in the Soviet Union. They could be fired from their work, and that was the most popular penalty for people. Okay, if they persisted before they were put in prison, occasionally people were locked in mental asylums, because the Soviets at that time assumed that people who are speaking against socialism, it means they're insane, they're crazy, and that is why assumption was that not a single normal person can speak against such a good thing as socialism and communism. So only crazy people can speak against these quote-unquote noble things. So that is why hundreds of people were locked in mental asylum hospitals and treated for mental asylum. So some doctors, psychiatrists colluded with the government and in fact signed the medical histories for these people who were totally sane, declaring them insane. Okay, that was one of the most favorite penalties under the new regime of stagnation. I repeat, people were not shot anymore, they were not put in prison for life, but they were still penalized in a devious and a vicious form, as I said, fired from work for speaking against socialism. That is why people were afraid, still afraid, to share anecdotes, to speak at work against socialism, against the government. And those brave who found guts to do it, they were either locked in mental asylums or received prison terms, like from 3 to 5 years mostly. Okay. The government still continued to practice quotas. Centralized economy was totally preserved, okay, which suffocated the economy. Okay, there was no room. Private property was forbidden. So that was still the law of the land. And when I say private property was forbidden, I mean it in a broad sense. Not only big factories, industrial facilities belonged to the state, not only banks, not only foreign trade was controlled by the government, but all stores, food stores, all barber shops, all workshops, any kind of facilities, everything was controlled by the government. Okay, that was the law of the land, which, I repeat, killed economic initiative. It was not visible in a short-term perspective, but especially during the war. But in the time of peace, it became so visible that by the 1970s, people, especially Eastern Europe, where they lived in a close proximity with Western countries like Western Germany, France, Austria, people could compare their lower living standards with the high living standards in Western Europe. And of course, this comparison was not in favor of socialist countries of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Plus, the United States and Western European countries, they transmitted radio shows to Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And within the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, people were able to receive these shows, receive the radio, shortwave radio. Millions of people tuned themselves to American radios that transmitted shows in Russian, French radio, Swedish radio, UK radio, where Western countries described Western music, Western clothing, where they read the books on radio, books forbidden in the Soviet Union. And of course, even though many Soviets could not visibly experience Western lifestyle, because traveling was still forbidden, especially in the Soviet Union and in many Eastern European countries, except Yugoslavia and partially Hungary. All Eastern European countries and China were totally closed societies. You couldn't travel back and forth. Okay, only trusted people were allowed in the Soviet Union to go to the Western countries as tourists. Normally, Communist Party officials, secret police informers, okay, some communist youth activists who had families because their families had to remain at home to be held as hostages in case they betrayed the Soviet motherland. So in the Soviet Union, they were limited the travel abroad to Western countries. Only trusted people were allowed to travel. Normally, I repeat, this ideological, these bureaucrats that served the regime or informers of the secret police. Okay, regular people were not allowed to travel. The borders were closed, and of course in China there was no foreign travel. Chinese people were not allowed to travel. In Eastern Europe, I repeat, the same thing. No people were allowed to travel back and forth except Hungary and Yugoslavia. Other socialist countries were total insulated societies. The only communication with the outside world was radio. That is why millions of people were tuned to Western radios. Okay, the quality of the products produced by the Soviet economy or economies in the socialist countries were so low because the major target was not the consumer. Okay, the factories that produce shoes, for instance, or coats, or pants, or shirts, they were not interested to cater to the most recent fashions. What they were cared about, they cared, managers at Soviet factories, let's say shoe factories or clothing factories, what they were concerned, they were mostly concerned about satisfying the quotas the government issued to them. For example, a shoe factory could receive an annual quote to produce, let's say, 2 million pairs of shoes. And nobody cared were they fashionable shoes or not, just 2 million shoes, and that's it. And when nobody wanted to buy them, nobody cared, okay? Because the major target was not the consumers, was not the consumer needs, but the demands of the government, which issued quotas to each factory in these so-called socialist countries. Okay, since consumer needs were still very much neglected, there were long lines for common products, okay, like chocolates, like bananas, regular items which for us normal items in our daily life. In the Soviet Union, in China, in many other socialist countries, only basic items were available, like between 14 and 20 food items, like bread, rice, potato, what else? Cabbage, the basic vegetables, basic foods. If you wanted to buy something else, you couldn't do it. It was a very, very much hard to get it, okay? Government only subsidized and provided the basic needs. Like imagine, for example, I'm trying to find something for you to compare because it's hard for you since you take for granted in life in Western countries, and some people think that's how all countries live and lived, you know. Some people don't even appreciate what they have here in the United States or in other Western countries. I'm trying to find for you an analogy how people lived in the Soviet Union. Okay, I found one. Imagine, you know probably the WIC program, WIK, that welfare benefit received by some of our families with little children from government. If your child is little, I forgot, up to what, 4 or 5 years, and if you one of the spouses, I think, doesn't have a job, so you're entitled to get to join the WIC program, WIC, WIC. Okay, what does it mean? It means each month you receive a box with basic foods like cereals, one box of cereals, a large chunk of cheese, 2 loaves of bread, some rice. Okay, what else? tortillas, maybe something else like basic items. Maybe a couple of sausages, okay, and maybe a chicken, the whole chicken, okay. So that's it. It varies, and that's it. So you cannot get more. So that's what it was. In fact, in Soviet Union, in many factories, people did receive these boxes each month. They received rations in a box. They were entitled to these rations. Why? Because these common items, subsidized, 14 to 20 items subsidized by the government, they were not always available in stores. Okay, so you see, by the way, here one of the pictures to a food store where people try to get some of these common items, like, for example, cheese. Cheese was one of those foods that was subsidized by the government, very low prices. Bread prices were very low. Government subsidized, I repeat, government subsidized these basic foods from 14 to 20 items, okay? And since the prices were so low, frequently they were not available in stores. People simply purchased them right away, okay? You had to, if they appeared in stores, you had to stay in a long line, and sometimes they said, oh, no more than 2 items in one to one person, okay? So you had to invite your relatives or friends to make sure that they would get some of these products, okay? Since it was hard to get these items, you had to catch them. In many factories, managers issued these monthly boxes to their workers. They had to pay for them, of course, but at least it was guaranteed. So each month you were entitled to a box that contained some cheese, sausages, maybe a box of chocolate candies, maybe a bottle of wine occasionally, okay, some juice, some basic items, okay, cereals. So in this case, you did need to stand in line, but not everybody was entitled to this. It depended on the factory. If a manager in a factory, the chief manager, was skillful enough, you know, he was able to make agreements with the local stores to for them to provide these monthly food boxes for his or her workers, okay? For example, I worked in local university in Samara Teachers College, and we didn't have this. Our president didn't make agreement with local food stores. So that is why we had to stay in line like these regular people, waiting when some of these items might appear, okay? You never knew. Anyway, the food, even the basic food items were not always available. The same about clothing. Fashionable clothing like jeans, fashionable shirts were not available for free purchase in stores. You can buy them at the black market, but not in regular stores. In regular stores, you had to use your connections. You had to know you need to have friends who worked in this place where they sold clothing. So it's a nightmare. It's hard for you to imagine how to live in this type of society, okay? To briefly describe to you, basically people had some minimum amount of money on their hands, but they couldn't always buy items they needed, even if they had money, okay? For example, I was a young PhD recipient. My first PhD was I received my first PhD in 1988, and my salary was high enough, but I couldn't buy with this money some of these items because they were missing. So I had to go to black market to buy my clothing, where I had to pay huge prices, okay? Here in the United States, for instance, we have the reverse situation when everything is available in stores, but frequently you don't have money, right, to buy it. See, that's how it works, okay? So I leave it up to you which type of society you prefer. Maybe some of you like to live in society when you have money, but you cannot buy anything, or sometimes you can buy things, you know. I personally prefer to live, I guess it's my bias, I prefer to live in a society where everything is available, but you don't always have money. And at least I might hope that I might earn this money. But again, I understand it might be a problem for some people who are looking for jobs. Okay, so I'm just giving you these two scenarios which we have: the life under full-fledged socialism and the life under capitalism. Anyway, the point here is that the economy, controlled totally by the government, did not encourage people to work productively, did not create incentives. You had to use all kind of connections to get something, you know, so everything was complicated. People were wasting a lot of time standing in lines, trying to get these basic items. And that's how even like scholars or people who were supposed to devote their time to creative occupations, they spent half of their time by doing these nonsense standing in lines. Or for instance, another major problem living under socialism was the lack of freedom of speech. You know, personally, by the way, I was not so much concerned about these lines, because I learned how to stay in these lines, and because I was reading the books. I didn't waste my time. I was reading books, I was making notes, so I tried to use two things at the same time. But what concerned me most is the lack of freedom of speech. So you were not allowed to speak freely. There were speech codes. So if you spoke against this, some politically incorrect, if you made politically incorrect statements, you could be fired from your work. You could be penalized, okay, and nobody would promote you. That is why all people were intimidated. Yeah, that was the problem. I don't know. For me, it was. I wouldn't like to live in this type of society where you constantly have to watch what you say, how you say it. You know, it's a nightmare. It's a George Orwell, 1984. What killed the Soviet Union? What eventually killed the Soviet Union? First, before we discuss this topic, I would like you to look at this. What actually sustained the Soviet Union, sustained socialism. And it also might be related to Chinese, somehow to the Chinese socialism. I will explain to you how. Now we're using Soviet Union as this example of the decline of socialist societies, because Soviet Union was the first country to kind of pave this road to socialism. And it's interesting to see why society existed for so long. 70 years socialism existed. Remember, Ludwig von Mises and Hayek argued that socialism was impossible from economic viewpoint, and we talked about this, remember? Why in this case Soviet Union and her allies were able to exist for 70 years, right? What sustained them? And in this case, look what sustained them. Soviet Union was a country rich in natural resources. So Soviet Union was selling natural resources, and that's how the Soviets were able to pay for the welfare of the people. That's how they provided general welfare. There's a little bit of something to everybody. Small salaries, there's like whatever boxes they provided to these food boxes, food rations to workers. Oil and gas prices were on the rise in 1973, in 1970s and until 1984. Oil and gas prices were on the rise, 500% increase. It's a lot. Basically, Soviet Union became like Saudi Arabia. It was prospering using these oil dollars. Prospering in quotation marks, because Soviet government basically used this money which they received from selling gas and oil to do what? To subsidize the military, because Soviets had one of the most powerful militaries in the world after the United States. And again, Soviets still believed that they was threatened by the United States, so they tried to spend a lot of money to subsidize the Soviet military. And the second, oil and gas dollars were used by this regime of stagnation, the Soviet socialist regime, to subsidize popular welfare. Imagine, again, the best way to think about the Soviet Union. You know that we have welfare recipients in many Western countries. For example, in the United States, we have 52 million, yes, 52 million people who receive welfare. Imagine the whole country. The whole country is on welfare. That's how it was in the Soviet Union. Okay, obviously it made some people happy, because especially people who didn't have small ambitions, or were satisfied with this. People have different expectations, but I assume not everybody was happy with this. It depends. For example, right now, jumping ahead, in the former Soviet Union, 40% of people, 40% of people still feel nostalgia for this type of society. Okay, even movies made like nostalgic. Oh, we had this glorious society where everybody was taken care of. There was total welfare. People were poor, but everybody was equal in poverty. And again, I understand this, so it might make some people happy. Okay, that we have different expectations. All right. Anyway, going back to 1970s, 1980s. So oil and gas profits plus selling of gold. Soviets also sold gold and diamonds. I forgot to mention diamonds. In Siberia, there were diamond mines discovered that gave a lot of profits to the Soviets, and the gold deposits were discovered, in addition to major items of income major items of revenue for the Soviets. I repeat, the major items of revenue for the Soviets in 1970s, 1980s were oil and gas. Oil and gas, okay. Soviet Union belonged to these countries which experienced so-called resource curse. They were cursed by this because they came to rely on selling natural resources, like Saudi Arabia, which spoiled them. How? They didn't feel need to make any changes in their economy, in social life, and political life. These were regimes, they were essentially parasites, like present-day Saudi Arabia. It's a parasitic regime, basically medieval regime headed by a king, which still practices some patriarchal stuff. You know, only recently women were allowed to drive a car. You know, can you imagine? So anyway, again, I'm not maybe I'm going too much criticizing the Saudis, right? Anyway, just a remark on the margins. But when you are showered with these oil dollars, you are not incentivized to change your society. You maintain everything as you're satisfied with your whatever you have. Okay, unlike small countries which don't have natural resources, like Netherlands, Japan, Denmark. Since they didn't have any resources, they had to use the noodles, ingenuity, to create to introduce new technologies, to encourage creativity. Okay, because there were no natural resources in these countries. Unfortunately, Soviet Union was not one of these countries. Again, it was spoiled with great natural resources. Plus, the money Soviets received from selling gas and oil, and where did they sell it? To the Western countries. Okay, money Soviets received from selling oil, gas, gold, they were used not only to fund the Soviet military and the general welfare of the population, subsidized food, subsidized healthcare, subsidized education, but this money was also used to fund the Soviet satellites all over the world, because Soviet Union had a bunch of allies which pledged allegiance to Soviet model of socialism. Like in Africa, there was Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia, okay, these countries, they joined the Soviet Union. In Asia, Vietnam, Laos, okay. Who else? In Latin America, Cuba, we talked about this country. Nicaragua, okay. Who else? So there was a bunch of countries which allied themselves to the Soviet Union, and they expected to receive military and food help. And that's what Soviet Union did. Drained her own resources to subsidize these proxy regimes, satellite regimes. They were anti-American, that pledged allegiance to the Soviet model of socialism. Okay. What killed the Soviet Union? It was decline. First, before you go through these major bullet points I mentioned, it's decline of the prices for natural resources. With in the middle of 1980s, prices for oil and gas started to go down. So Soviets were not able to accumulate the revenues they had done before. Okay, so that was the major reason. But in addition to this major reason, we have what? We have the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Cold War, remember, Cold War. Competition. Who would produce more hardware, military hardware? Who would have more nuclear missiles? Okay, who would have bigger missiles? It's some kind of there was some kind of Freudian competition. Who would have a bigger missiles, bigger guns? You know, Soviets stockpiled them, Americans stockpiled them. Who would have more and more, and eventually, both nations accumulated so much that Soviets literally were drowned in these hardware. Okay, invested so much money. It was a huge waste of resources. And since Soviet economy was, I repeat, inefficient economy, remember, because it was not based on market. There was no free market, no elements of free market. It was a stagnant society. So they had to work harder. They had to invest more resources since they wasted more resources. And they had to divert more budget money to subsidize the military. Up to 40%, up to 25% of Soviet budget was spent to subsidize the military industry. In the US, only 9%. Okay, see the difference. So essentially, it was only a matter of time before US would economically exhaust the Soviet Union by this arms race. And that's what happened. As a result of this competition, inefficient Soviet economy was undermined, was destroyed. Okay. Plus, Soviets had to keep 1/4 of its army on Sino-Soviet border in the east, because remember, China was a communist country like Soviet Union, but they had a competition. They hated each other. Remember, we talked about it, because at some point the Chinese militant communists hated the Soviets because they denounced Stalin, cult of personality, and Chinese said, "Oh, it's wrong. We love Stalin. He's a good guy." Okay. And finally, they started to compete. The support of clients, numerous clients in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, exhausted Soviet economy, exhausted. And the final straw that killed, broke the back of the Soviet regime was the Afghanistan War, the war in Afghanistan. What happened in Afghanistan? There was a coup d'etat attempted by a small Marxist group composed of students who was schooled in the Soviet Union. Okay, Afghanistan, a country located on the border with the Soviet Union, a Muslim country. It was a kingdom. Okay, kingdom until 1979. But this kingdom had a lot of agreements with the Soviet Union. There were friendly relationships, and a bunch of students from Afghanistan went to study in Moscow and in Leningrad. So they became indoctrinated in the Soviet ideology. And in 1979, a small group of Marxists trained in the Soviet Union, they staged the coup d'etat and they kicked out the king. Okay, they kicked out the king and declared that this Muslim country would become a Marxist regime. And what they did, petrified the whole population, because Marxist, that was, well, you know, Marxism, it's a militant atheism. But the country of Afghanistan was and still is 90% Muslim, right? Now even more probably. At that time, it was most secular country, so people many people didn't wear veils, okay, were free, and especially in cities. Now, of course, it's a die-hard Muslim country. At that time, I repeat, it was not so, I would say, anal about its Muslim faith, Afghanistan, okay? But what these Marxists did, who took over power, they declared that, oh, we are going to impose atheism on the entire country. They tried to outlaw Islam. They tried to destroy mosques, okay, which petrified people, okay, which antagonized people. And when you antagonize people, okay, when you impose something on them, of course you begin to resist, okay. Why should people accept this? So a resistance, a huge resistance started to throw away these Marxist and the atheistic regime. And that was the rise of militant Islam in Afghanistan. See, the Soviets were the ones, the Soviet backed up regime in Afghanistan, this Marxist regime. That's what triggered this, at least partially triggered the rise of Islamic fundamentalists in the Middle East, okay, in Central Asia and the Middle East. There was Iran, of course, where a similar thing happened. Only in Iran, it was the United States and Britain which antagonized people, where royal regime tried to promote in Iran this militant modernization, okay. But in case of Afghanistan, it was the Soviets who also tried to promote not only militant modernization, but militant atheism, okay. Anyway, Afghanistan became a battleground between these Soviets who preached atheism and militant Islamic fundamentalism, okay. All this crowd, Osama bin Laden and the rest, they were there. They tried their skills, quote unquote, in the fight against the Soviets, where they that's where they started everything. These militant Islamic groups, they were born in the 1980s during this resistance movement against Soviet Marxist regime in Afghanistan. Soviets invaded Afghanistan to back up this Marxist regime that was fighting against Islamic resistance. A huge bloody war started, a huge bloody war. Millions of people died, 100,000 Soviet soldiers were killed. It's like Soviet Vietnam. So think about Vietnam War, only double it, because during Vietnam War we have, what, 50,000 American soldiers been dead. Here you have more than 100,000 Soviet soldiers been killed, and plus 2 million Afghanistan people were killed and wounded, okay. Soviets were brutal. They carpet bombed Afghani villages, which created more indignation, animosity, and soon we have all Arabic countries sending here to Afghanistan Muslim fighters. So it's like Muslim international. It was a total mess, you know. It's a bloody war. But we are more interested, right? We are not interested right now in discussing these wars. The reason I'm discussing all these, because I want to make a point, and my major point is that it was a huge money pit. The Soviets drained so much their own resources. They threw away billions of dollars funding this war. It was a huge waste, okay. In addition to being hated by the whole Muslim world, Soviets wasted a huge amount of resources. And of course, the war was very unpopular within the Soviet Union. It was a horrible thing. Soviets were losing prestige in the third world, okay. But ironically, you will be laughing, but the Western experts didn't see, many Western experts, majority of Western experts, they didn't see these things, which it's a common knowledge what I'm just telling you, that the Soviets destroyed themselves by fighting this Afghanistan War. Soviets wasted their money by subsidizing satellites, and plus Soviet inefficient economy could not function well. Okay, it was obvious, but many Western experts, they didn't see it. Why? Because they became prisoners of the Soviet statistics that was forged. Soviets didn't report any objective statistics, so it was total fraud, because in fact it was a criminal offense within the Soviet Union to collect exact statistics about working conditions, about people's incomes, about performance of economy. Okay, so the government simply invented numbers, okay, based on some criteria that were arbitrarily imposed by the government. Okay, Soviets in fact didn't know exactly how many, the population of the Soviet Union didn't know exactly how much output was produced by Soviet factories. Okay, because everything was secret. All kind of data was not allowed to be reported, and those data which was allowed to report, it had to be doctored in order for the Soviets not to lose the international prestige. See, the major point was to maintain the prestige of the Soviet Union. Okay, the Soviets essentially reported to the United Nations, to some international, like Soviets were members of many international organizations, and they reported the fraudulent statistics. Okay, a CIA did try to digest this somehow, to decipher the Soviet forged statistics, but it was really hard because the Soviets themselves didn't know what was going on within the Soviet Union. So American intelligence experts did try, but still they had to operate with the Soviet numbers, which were numbers from nowhere. Okay, false Soviet statistics. So the CIA, working with the Soviet statistics, trying to adjust it, okay, to tame it somehow, still came to conclusion that Soviet economy would be growing 6% growth. Okay, and in fact, American college students, especially those who were specialized in economics, they were learning about Soviet economy from a few paragraphs in this book. It was most popular book about economics, a textbook called Economics, written by Paul Samuelson, one of the popular economists at that time in the United States. In this book, ironically, and I purposely gave you the picture of this book because you will be laughing when you look through this book. Okay, for example, I went through a few editions of this book, and if you look in 1961 edition, in this edition he says Soviet income shall overtake US income by 1984. Can you imagine? So he was using Soviet statistics, and he predicted that Soviet income overtake US income, and he even reported the year. Okay, another edition, I forgot what, 10th edition or 12th edition, because each year he made millions of dollars, this guy, by publishing this book each year. So generations of students use this book to learn about socialist economy, this high performance of socialist economy. Okay, the most recent edition before the Soviet Union collapsed, 1989. Soviet economy proves that it can function well. Can you imagine? And this guy, Samuelson, he explained, okay, there was an obvious fact that Soviet agriculture did not perform well. In fact, in 1960s, 1970s, the performance of Soviet agriculture, where I repeat, peasant collective agriculture, did not have any incentives to work hard. Peasants didn't work to work hard in the collective farms. They were taking care of their small garden plots in front of their houses. They didn't care about collective fields. Anyway, that is why the output, Soviet output, the cereals were, not enough cereals were produced. So Soviets had to buy grain from Canada and the United States. And of course, it was the sore spot on the body of the Soviet economy. So how did the Soviets explain this flaw? They said, oh, we have a bad weather, very bad weather. Okay, that is why we have these poor crops. And this guy, Paul Samuelson, he fully accepted this explanation. So in this book, read this book, you will see it. People were not fools, of course. You can fool people like for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, but you cannot fool entire society for like for 60 years, for 70 years. And eventually within the Soviet Union, society, a lot of people became cynical, okay, because they were promised that they would live under glorious communism, when everything would be plentiful, and each generation saw it would never arrive. So when would it arrive? So in 10, 15 years, that's what the Soviet leaders did in the past. Okay, they said, oh, it would arrive, this glorious communist future, and the glorious communist future did not arrive. By 1980s, many Soviet people became very cynical about this, about prophecy of communism. So that is why in the underground art, we have a bunch of cynicism about the Soviet communism. So we have popular style of art, I repeat, underground, of course, unofficial. Because the official art was socialist realism. Remember, socialist realism. It was the official doctrine that glorified the communist future, that encouraged Soviet poets, writers, artists to depict the life not as it was, but as it is going to be in the future. Okay, so this type of art became the object of mockery, and underground artists now, they use some Western billboards, Western advertisements, just to make fun of communism. See, here you can see this Lenin's profile, the Lenin, the chief Bolshevik, paired with Coca-Cola sign, or there was a group of artists that made mock of the Soviet posters, because Soviet posters everywhere, you know, plastered everywhere in all major Soviet cities. They said, oh, onward to the final victory of communism. So some underground artists who were cynical about this prophecy, they started to use American flags with this mockery of Soviet slogans, onward to the final victory of capitalism, okay, making fun of Soviet communism. And in fact, American flag was widely used in underground and Soviet underground as the symbol of freedom. In China, by the way, it was also widely used until recently. Was used by the students to attack the Chinese communism. Recently, by the way, if you follow the international protest movement, you know that in Hong Kong, where Chinese Communist Party shut down self-government of the people, imposed the communist dictatorship, shut down, I repeat, the city government, and imposed the power of the Communist Party, squashed local courts. Okay, people went to the streets in Hong Kong to protest against this imposition by using American flags, because American flag is it's not national for many people outside of this United States, people who fight for individual liberty, because I suppose you know that in many countries of the world to the present, people do not have constitution, do not have individual liberty. So for many people, the symbol of protest against the regimes, dictatorships, when they fight for a constitution to have free elections, freedom of speech, freedom of press, when people fight for these things in other countries. For example, in present day Hong Kong, China, even in Russia, by the way, present day Russia, protest movements frequently use American flag, because in the eyes of not all, I repeat, but in eyes of many people, it's still stands for freedom. Again, I'm not discussing this how it is viewed here in the United States, but I'm telling you how it is viewed in some countries outside of the United States. Okay. In the meantime, the leadership, Soviet leadership, was growing so old that this old Stalinist nomenclature was nearing the age when these Soviet leaders became literally walking dead. That is why I'm using this expression, walking dead. Aged Soviet leaders who rose in power during Stalin times, and now they became aged in their 70s, 80s. For example, the person who took over power when Khrushchev, who did de-Stalinization, when Khrushchev was ousted, the person who took over power was Leonid Brezhnev. This was the guy who presided over the regime of stagnation. Okay, and by the early 1980s, this guy became so old, weak. He was 76-year-old man. Okay, entire Politburo were old men. And since there were no elections in the Soviet Union, remember, there were no elections. So Communist Party controlled everything. The small oligarchy was in power. There's 9 people, so-called Politburo. These were the people who controlled the life in the country. Okay, that is why there was no fresh blood. Okay, there was no fresh blood coming in. And nomenclature controlled everything. And this nomenclature was afraid to make any changes. But you could not defeat the nature. See, these people were aging. Okay. And eventually this guy, Brezhnev, dies in 1988. Okay. This guy dies. And what we have? We have a new guy coming to replace him. This guy named Yuri Andropov. That's how his name is spelled. He was also an aged and ill man. Okay, he was 74-year-old, but he had a bad kidney disease, and he actually was in power 1 year, mostly in bed, before he died in 1985. And then another old guy comes. So his name was Yuri Chernenko. He was a very ill guy who has asthma, very bad asthma. So he had to be held when he went to a podium to deliver a speech. He hardly was able to speak. His verbal skills were very low. He had his speech. He interrupted himself. He couldn't concentrate on anything. So he was the symbol of this regime of stagnation, the stagnant system, Soviet stagnant system. So the very nature, the very situation, what I'm describing to you right now, symbolized what the declining Soviet system, this declining Soviet socialist welfare system that was going down again. And I repeat, the fate of these people, unelected people, okay, who represented the Soviet nomenclature, they symbolize this decline of the Soviet socialism. Okay, and this guy Chernenko again dies a year late in 1986. So it was so ridiculous. The whole world. Now, of course, you don't remember, but if you ask some of you who are my age, older, or if you talk with your fathers and mothers, you might ask them and they will tell you how the whole world was laughing at what was going on at that time in the Soviet Union, because each year Soviets were carrying coffins, you know, one leader after another, they were dying. Okay, the Mother Nature dictated its own laws. So that's when this Politburo, the small group, realized they needed to bring a new guy to the picture somehow. Okay, a new guy. And eventually they chose Mikhail Gorbachev, relatively a young man, again, young in quotation marks, because he was 50 year old. And by the way, he was put in charge of the Soviet agriculture because nobody wanted to be in charge it was the kind of killing job to be in charge of something that didn't work, right? Because Soviet agriculture was totally collectivized, and there was no incentive among the peasants to work hard. So he was put in charge of the Soviet agriculture, like a suicidal mission. And he was the only one in the Soviet leadership who was relatively old, 56-year-old. And that is why these old men who still remained in Politburo, they said, hey, let's pick up him. So at least he looks young. Little did they know that they opened the so-called Pandora's box. Okay, the problem is that Gorbachev, see, that's the power of the ideas. Gorbachev matured during the Khrushchev age, during the age of de-Stalinization. Remember, we talked about Khrushchev, when Khrushchev denounced the cult of personality, when people were released from Stalin's concentration camps. And plus, this guy was a student, a law student at the Moscow State University. Okay, unlike the other Politburo guys who didn't have college education. So the guys whom I mentioned before, they were poor educated. Okay, they were not well versed. Okay, but Gorbachev was a person of education. He was in a law school at Moscow State University. His wife was a professor of philosophy, so a bookish woman. It was I wouldn't say he was an intellectual, but he was a well-rounded person. Okay, let me put it this way. He could be self-reflective. Okay, he could critically think about what was going on around him. Okay. He matured during Khrushchev time, the time of de-Stalinization. Plus, he lived in the same dorm with one of the leaders of the Czechoslovakia Prague Spring. Remember, briefly I mentioned there was an attempt to build socialism with a human face in Czechoslovakia in 1968, so-called the Prague Spring, when Czech communists on the heels of de-Stalinization tried to build what they called socialism with a human face, okay, to declare freedom of speech, freedom of press, okay, and also to introduce multi-party system. And of course, Soviets didn't like it, they hated it, and eventually they suppressed this Prague Spring with the Soviet tanks. They sent Soviet military to squash this democratic socialism with which Czech communists wanted to build in Czechoslovakia. Anyway, Gorbachev lived in the same dorm with one of the leaders of this movement to build democratic socialism. So now you see that his mind was infested with these heretical ideas of democratic socialism. Okay, because Soviets, of course, couldn't stand any democratic socialism. For them, socialism was the only correct version of socialism. It was the Soviet version of socialism, the Stalinist model. Okay, of course, not brutal, but reformed Stalinist model. But Gorbachev was exposed to these subversive ideas, and now look, this person was appointed to be in charge of the Soviet Union. But this old man, okay, they thought he could be trusted. He becomes the general secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1985. The general secretary of the Soviet Union, it was the general secretary of the Communist Party. It was the highest position in the Soviet Union, okay. He didn't have any clear idea of what he was going to do, okay. But he realized something should be done about the Soviet system, okay. Even though he was a person of education, but he didn't read the books that explained free market or some market system, because it was forbidden in the Soviet Union. Okay, it was forbidden to read books they discuss like free prices. For example, Ludwig von Mises, Hayek, it was totally forbidden. It was subversive. Okay, if people were found reading these books, you could be penalized. Okay, the most hated books. Okay, even if you found books about democratic socialism within the Soviet Union, reading these books, you could be penalized. Okay, so he was not exposed to these ideas. It's like, imagine in university, for example, some students exposed to only one set of ideas, okay? Like you feed them year to year, from year to year, one set of ideas, and you completely cut off them from the rest of ideas. Or you might tell them, oh, don't read these books because they're evil books, okay? You cannot read books. You only have to read these allowed books, okay? And of course, you put yourself in an intellectual bubble, and you will be exposed to only correct books and correct ideas, quote unquote, okay? This type of situation existed in the Soviet Union. There was a huge bubble in colleges, Soviet colleges, universities. You were only allowed to be exposed to a set of correct ideas, quote unquote, correct ideas. That is why Gorbachev didn't know anything about other books that had been published in the West. He was like this. I can compare him with this blind kitten. Yes, blind kitten who was blind, didn't know where to go. Okay, but he felt that something should be done, and he went by the familiar route. What was the familiar route? Since he matured during Khrushchev time, and what was going on during Khrushchev time? A partial criticism of Stalin. Remember, that's how Khrushchev rose in power. He criticized Stalin. He said Stalin was bad. Okay, we need to criticize what he did. And that's what Gorbachev started doing. He said, let's do openness. He called glassness, openness. It means openness. Let's criticize Stalinism. Stalin. Basically, let's continue where Khrushchev stopped. Okay, that's how he started. He didn't speak about legalizing private property at first, but he criticized Stalin, so that was the first step. In 1987, that was the crucial year, 1987, November 1987. When the Soviets celebrated the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917 revolution, Gorbachev delivered a speech where he said, for the first time, he used the word Stalinism, because it was forbidden even to use the word Stalinism. He said, Stalinism, it was the curse of our socialist systems. He did not denounce yet socialism, okay, because he was part of the system. What he said, that we need to criticize Stalinism, we need to purge Stalinism from our socialist system, and we need to reform our socialist system to make it good, because he was still a true believer himself. He believed in democratic socialism, okay? It's like, imagine Martin Luther, again, I'm just a history analogy, who comes to and says, oh, Roman Pope is bad, you know, like, I'm going to criticize him. Let's go to back to the sacred book of the Bible. Let's criticize the Pope because Pope is bad. But Martin Luther was still a Christian, right? He didn't ask people to go outside of the Christianity. So Martin Luther, criticized the Roman Pope by being a Christian, okay? So it's Christian against Christian. The same thing is here. So Gorbachev was a socialist, a communist. He was a member of the Communist Party. But he, like Khrushchev, criticized Stalin. Gorbachev did the same thing. He criticized Stalin by arguing that he wanted to improve socialism, okay? Basically, he said, like Khrushchev, same thing. Stalin was a criminal. He destroyed our system. And Khrushchev was not allowed to complete his job. We need to continue fighting against Stalinism. By criticizing Stalinism, we will cleanse socialism. We will make it better. Okay, that was his idea. He invited people to criticize. Let's do criticism. Let's criticize communist bureaucracy. It's a very dangerous route, right? See, that's why nomenclature revolted against Khrushchev in 1964, because the fear was that he soon might criticize nomenclature and soon the Soviet elite might be threatened. But now, look, Gorbachev stepped on the same ground, okay? openness, glassness. Let's criticize communist bureaucrats. Okay, let's criticize Stalin. Let's allow forbidden books to be published. Okay, including Hayek, Mises, including books about democratic socialism like Herbert Marcuse, and I will mention this, including like socialist reformers like Bernstein. Okay, any kind of books. Nothing should be forbidden. And of course, many Soviets were happy about this, like to ingest this forbidden fruit, because censorship before Gorbachev was so high that now it was the floodgate. Soviets were reading stories, books exposing Stalin, his crimes. There was much interest in history at that time, 1987, 1988. Okay, and the more people criticized, the more they moved to the criticism of socialism. At first, Gorbachev assumed that, oh, we're going to criticize Stalinism and we're going to make socialism better. But little did he know that he essentially, as I said, opened the can of worms. Okay, from criticism of Stalinism, people gradually switched to criticism of communism. From criticism of communism, they switched to criticism of socialism, and eventually there was we already have powerful anti-communist voices within the Soviet Union. See, if you allow a small brick to be removed from the building of the dictatorship, of course, sooner or later the whole building of dictatorship would crumble. Okay, and that's exactly what happened in the Soviet Union. Okay, so soon emboldened people started to open the doors of criticism wider and wider, more and more. And soon Gorbachev himself, he said, hey, why don't we try multi-party system? In 1990, he said, it's not democratic to have only one party in political system. So he removed from the Soviet constitution, which had been written under Stalin, before in the Soviet constitution, it was written that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was the only ruling party allowed. So no other parties allowed. So he replaced this stipulation. I forgot the number of the article that stipulated the ruling position of the Communist Party. So he removed this article in 1990, and the multi-party system was introduced in the Soviet Union. And of course, that was the death warrant. That was the death warrant to the Soviet Union. See, indirectly, without knowing this, he was undermining the building of Soviet socialism, because Soviet socialism was built and based on this totalitarian one-party system. Okay, naive Gorbachev believed that he would improve the socialist system. In reality, he was destroying the system. He was destroying the system. Like Khrushchev, Gorbachev was ready to mingle with people. He was shaking their hands. He was hugging them. Okay. He realized that disciplinary penalty didn't work. You need to create, again, he didn't read these books, how economy should work. Okay, because books about Western-style market-based economy were forbidden in the Soviet Union. Okay, they were not published before him. But he felt that you do need some kind of economic incentives. You cannot force people to work. It doesn't work. Okay, another thing, he was the first Soviet leader who broke with the patriarchic monopoly, because before Soviet leaders, they were very much patriarchal people, you know. They were, it was normal for them to keep their wives somewhere in the shadow. Gorbachev was the first one who broke with this powerful tradition, conservative tradition. Soviet communism was very much conservative, I have to say, very much conservative, misogynistic in many respects, to some extent, although I repeat, in early Bolshevism did open some doors to women, okay? But still in 1970s, 1980s, it was a very much closed, insulated system. Gorbachev was the first a politician, Soviet politician, who broke with this tradition. He involved his wife into politics. Okay, and when he traveled all over Soviet Union, he gave voice to his wife, and they were speaking together about politics in front of the people. Okay, and it was very shocking, which pleasantly surprised some of the people. But the conservative elements within the Soviet Union were shocked at this. They couldn't believe their eyes. How could it be? Which, I repeat, made a huge disservice to Gorbachev, because these conservative elements of the Soviet society, they didn't like that he consulted his wife about the political decisions and things like that. Okay, because, I repeat, Soviet nomenclature, bureaucracy, and some elements in the Soviet society, they were very much conservative people. Okay, another thing what Gorbachev did, he removed the monetary support. He stopped providing generous monetary support to the Soviet clients. For example, I said Soviet Union sponsored regimes, friendly regimes in Africa and Asia, or another, it's really crazy what the Soviets did. They sponsored communist parties. Remember, communist parties originally were the members of Communist International. Of course, now I mean 1970s, 1980s, Communist International did not exist anymore. It had been shut down by Stalin in 1943. But still, the tradition, Comintern, Communist International tradition, to sponsor communist parties by giving them money to what? To work to undermine Western governments. This tradition still continued. Okay? This tradition continued. So until the very end, that's the irony, until the very end, until 1991, that's the time when Soviet Union collapsed. Soviet Union provided funds to the communist parties. French Communist Party, British Communist Party, okay, West German Communist Party, and United States Communist Party. Okay, in fact, U.S. Communist Party received thousands of dollars from. It's a fact. It's a medicinal fact. They were funded by the Soviet government that provided funds for them to buy properties and whatever they needed to print their newspaper. And that's same thing was done in UK, same thing was done in France. Okay, Gorbachev started shutting down this money pit, and eventually he shut down this. Cuba wasn't sponsored anymore. Gorbachev shut down this. He said, I'm not going to support you because it's a huge money drain for us. Okay, so it was, of course, very bad for Fidel Castro. Remember, we talked last time about Fidel Castro regime. He was very mad at his Soviet sponsors, so he tried to go to China. Okay, so what essentially Gorbachev did, and I like to show this cartoon to my students. I always show this cartoon to my students. He literally destroyed Soviet socialism without knowing this. Okay, because Soviet regime was powerful as long as it was based on this totalitarian dictatorship, this totalitarian pyramidal power, one-party system. When he began to change the system started to crumble. And this cartoon describes really well what happened. Look at this cartoon. A guy, Gorbachev, it's a cartoon of Gorbachev. Essentially, he stands and said, oh, my friends, I didn't mean it. Something happened. And what happened? In 1991, Soviet Union started to collapse gradually. You know that Soviet Union originally had 15 republics, within the Soviet Union: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine. It's like countries, okay, socialist countries, but within the Soviet Union. They had their own government, but they depended on Moscow, and they were included within the Soviet Union. So basically, what happened is Soviet secret police, Soviet military had control over these countries, but within these countries they had their own branches of the Soviet Communist Party. Okay, indigenous communist parties control these areas, okay? But the general leadership was provided from Moscow, so they were part of so-called Soviet Union, okay? There were 15 of them. So now these are independent countries, okay? But plus we have Soviet satellites, which were not Soviet republics, but they also depended on the Soviet Union, although they had more rights than Soviet republics, okay? They had more rights. They had, unlike these republics, which were not allowed to have their own armies, the Soviet satellite countries in Eastern Europe, they were allowed to have their own armies and secret police. See, that's basically the difference. But they similarly depended on the Soviet Union economically, okay, very much dependent on the Soviet Union. And now under Gorbachev, since he destroyed his pyramidal power that was controlled from Moscow, the whole structure started to collapse, okay? And of course, the conservative elements within the Soviet Communist Party, they hated it. They thought the whole world was going to hell. And they tried a coup d'etat. They tried a coup d'etat in 1991, in August 1991. A group of people within the Soviet Communist Party, they prepared a coup d'etat against Gorbachev. Okay, they put him under house arrest, and they tried to reverse this movement, reverse the collapse of Soviet Union. And what happened and how the situation developed, jumping ahead, I want to stress that the coup attempt failed and how it failed and what was going on, plus what happened in Eastern European countries after this coup d'etat attempt failed, and plus what was going on in communist China, we are going to consider next time in our next conversation. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you.